Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Allen County, Indiana Saltwater Conservation District. We're going to be discussing coffee and integrated pest management today in our series, November 16th, 2021. If you have trouble with pests or want to learn about an alternative method to dealing with them, this is the place to be. I'm Mike Whirling, a technical specialist agronomist at the SWCD and a conservation advocate using restorative agriculture on my farm. I have an active farm. We are recording this session. Please have your audio on mute unless less talking, and you can use the chat function, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. Today we have Laura Ingwell, a professor of horticulture and entomology at Purdue University, and Marissa Renz, a local gardener and educator in Fort Wayne here. So let's just jump right into Laura and join her.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me see. Okay, are we all set? Someone you can see full screen?
Yep, we're looking good. Integrated pest management.
Thank you, Mike.
Good audio.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm excited today to talk to you a little bit about my research and what IPM looks like and how you can apply IPM principles in your garden is sort of what I have it geared towards, but we can talk about it in other contexts if that's of interest. And so like Mike said, I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University. My role is to support specialty crop producers in insect pest management. My expertise, or what I've spent most of my time on, is in high tunnels, or what we call protected environments. And so at the research farm here in Lafayette, we actually have 13 high tunnels that we can work in at the moment. And we've learned a lot of interesting things over the past few years as we explore production in this semi-protected environment. Specifically, I've spent a lot of time working on tomatoes and tomato-associated pests, cucumber and specialty melon production in these systems. Some of the pests and pathosystems that I've worked with is the cucumber beetles. So here you can see both striped and spotted cucumber beetles. Striped here, spotted. They're a really important pest for cucurbit production because they transmit a pathogen called bacterial wilt. That's what you see in the top photo here. And this bacteria actually resides in the xylem tissue of the plant, and it clogs up these transport vessels. And so water can't flow up and down the plant. So you end up with this wilt and plant death. Some other sort of expected and common pests that we see in protected environment systems are two-spotted spider mites. Occasionally, we see some other mite species here. This is the potato russet mite or tomato russet mite. Aphids, of course, and then I've also used commercially available bumblebees to aid in pollination of these specialty crops in controlled environments. I'm particularly interested in using sustainable and biological practices to help manage pests. And so what that means is a lot of research looking at the efficacy of utilizing natural enemies to try to suppress pest populations. And so we've looked at lady beetles, lacewings, the minute pirate bug, parasitoids, Cyripid flies, and predatory mites. And so that's just a little bit of an overview or background of where my interests and expertise really lie. For today, the objective is to provide you with the tools to prevent these situations. Okay, so here's just some snapshots of what has gone unmanaged and wrong in some field situations. And so hopefully I'm going to equip you with the tools to be able to prevent this level of damage. And so the strategy that we're talking about today is integrated pest management. So what this means to me, there's a lot of different definitions out there, but I really like this one that comes from the University of California's A&R extension team, and that is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques. And this is what's really key, this long-term prevention. It's not elimination, okay? So we have to have some level of tolerance for what these pests are, but a long-term strategy. So year after year, implementing things on our farm to minimize these damages. And so we have a lot of different tools and techniques that we can use. Variety or cultivar selection, timing of planting, the location of plantings. We can do some habitat manipulation, biological control, and the very last thing in the context of IPM is resorting to the use of pesticides. And so when we talk about or walk through this toolbox, I like to put each of these tools into 4 different categories. So we're going to start out with some examples of what cultural controls are. Then we'll move into mechanical controls, biological, and lastly, chemical. Okay, so reviewing what are our cultural controls. Again, this is in the context of fruit and vegetable production, but it can expand beyond that to some of our agronomic crops as well. And so the very first line of defense is seed selection. If we know that there is a source of resistance within a crop type, you can select seeds that are resistant to that pest in order to prevent the issue from the first place. Sometimes this is based on a variety within a particular species or a cultivar within a particular species. And sometimes it means that we just have to rotate away from a crop type altogether. For instance, with potatoes and Colorado potato beetle. Sometimes we need to just take a break and not grow any potatoes or any solanaceous crops for a year to help get that pest under control. Another cultural control is timing. And so that has to deal with the coordination of when the pest is present on the landscape and when the susceptible crop is present on the landscape, and how can we alter that timing so that they are out of sync and not occurring. And then lastly is location here. And so when we talk about seed selection, many companies include this category of resistance or tolerance to disease information. Disease tolerance or disease resistant is pretty well known and documented. So when you're looking at selecting varieties to grow, make sure that you look in the catalog or you look at what these different codes are when you're selecting your variety. It's a really useful tool to help prevent problems. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of that published when it comes to insects, but that doesn't mean that it's not present in that selection. So the best way to optimize this is planting mixes. So mix varieties and mix cultivars and take your own detailed observations and notes on insect preference or resistance among varieties. Rotating your crops, again, so rotating them spatially within the growing area or from year to year in order to minimize this buildup of soil-borne pests or pathogens. Intercropping can be another effective tool. And it's something that's easier to implement on the small scale, like in a backyard garden, than it is on a large commercial scale. And the way that intercropping works is, in one sense, you are interfering with the insect's ability to locate its host plant. So if you have a more diverse habitat here, an insect that specializes on one crop that may be hidden down here under the canopy of these large tomatillos may be more difficult for that insect to find. So that's one way that intercropping works. Another way is that you can actually have plants that have chemical or physical characteristics that repel or deter insects. And by intercropping or putting those plants together with suitable host plants, you can help prevent or minimize the insect from colonizing. If you're using containers, pay attention to the health of the soil in that container. And so we don't always have to replace our growing media every single year, but you do have to watch for potential insects that could be overwintering in those containers or potential pathogens that could be building up in that soil. And so if you can sterilize it either through solarization or just replacing that container soil when you start to see some detrimental impacts. And making sure that you start with clean plants, okay? If you're not direct seeding, but purchasing starts from a garden center or from your local farmer who sells them in the spring, make sure that they're clean. So all too often, if you go to Ace Hardware or Walmart and you look closely at these starts, you can find aphids and thrips and whiteflies on all of those plants. So before you purchase them, look, make sure they're clean, or if they're not clean, make sure you have a strategy in place to help knock back that pest population before you put them into the garden. And be proactive. So moving into monitoring and early detection. So once you've done everything that you can prior to planting to try to minimize, the next thing is once the plants are in the garden, make sure that you are watching for those pests and you know what to expect. So if you're growing tomatoes, make sure you know what the common tomato pests are in Indiana and what that damage looks like. We have a lot of different resources available to help you with that. And so one of those is the Purdue Plant Doctor apps. So these are very diagnostic image friendly to help you identify issues in the garden. And so there's tomatoes, trees, perennials, annuals, and turf available in those apps. We also have websites. We have a vegetable website and a fruit website that have extensive photo galleries that can help familiarize you with what you can expect in our region on particular crops. And if you do encounter something and you don't know what it is, you can always utilize your local soil and water, NRCS, Purdue Extension office for help, or you can contact the Diagnostic Lab directly. So this is the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. It's located on the main campus. Their job is to help you identify issues in your forest, in your garden, in your lawn, sort of anywhere that you're interacting with plants. You can submit pictures or physical samples. It's a very small fee, something like $11, and they can give you an answer to your question and provide some recommendations. Make sure that you understand the life cycle of the insects that you expect to encounter. Having the proper identification really will help guide your management decisions and tailor those actions to something that's suitable. For instance, thrips are an example of an insect that is very cryptic. It can be difficult to see on the plant, and it spends half of its life cycle in the soil or in the growing media. This is very similar for a lot of beetle pests and a lot of lepidopteran pests who sometimes pupate in the soil. So understanding that pest biology here and knowing that this is what you can see above ground on the plant doing the damage are adults that are feeding. But this very important developmental stage is occurring below ground can help you tailor management to get at both of those stages of that pest development. And so making sure that you are out in the garden and you're scouting. Some of these pests are really good at camouflaging and hiding. And so looking on the tops of leaves, bottoms of leaves, old growth, new growth, and looking sometimes for some of the signs that an insect may be depositing on the plant rather than the insect itself. So here's a picture of a tobacco hornworm feeding on tomato, right? This is a very late instar, so very large, very bright green, hangs in an orientation that makes it very difficult to find. But as they feed on this plant, they remove leaf tissue. So you'll see leaves with big holes in it, and they poop these little grenades. So their frass comes out of the horn end here and will rain down on the plant. And you'll see these like bright green grenades laying on the leaves. That's easier to find than the insect itself. So recognizing that can help you with this early detection. And again, knowing where on the plant to look. So here is a picture of basil that's infested with aphids. And so knowing that you need to flip those leaves up and look at the underside, and what you're looking for is almost translucent feeding on this plant, will help you with that early detection before the plant is completely covered and wilting. And being able to recognize those different life stages. So again, here's an example of that tomato hornworm. It's very large, and it is contributing to this holes in the leaves. But if you look closely right next to it, that's the stage you want to be able to identify. This is an early instar, so very, very small, harder to find. They're not chewing as much and causing as much damage, but once they get to this size, they can really defoliate a whole plant. And we have some different tools available to help you with identifying some of these small pests. And so I just like to show you some of the things that I use. Sticky cards are a great passive monitoring tool. Okay, so they won't actually control a pest, but they are a good way to be able to identify what's there, especially for things that are really small and hard to see on the plant. And so you can just hang them up around the garden. I typically put them around the border of the garden. You can do them outside and inside of a controlled environment, and they're really going to be intercepting any insects that are moving across the landscape and into that habitat. And so you monitor that sticky card to see what is present and could potentially be feeding on your crops. A lot of these pests are really small, so we use things like these hand magnification lenses. This is actually a magnification lens that clips on your phone, so you can take pictures of really small insects. And this is a microscope that lights up and just can plug into your phone or your computer. Pretty inexpensive, but can really help you to get a better look at some of those small pests. Okay, so we've reviewed cultural controls. We're going to turn now to mechanical controls. Here in Indiana, you can expect certain pests to show up, and they will find your garden no matter what. And so here's a snapshot of some of them. Some are crop specific and some are generalist. So crop specific means if you grow the suitable host, they will come to the garden and feed on that. But if you want to get rid of that pest, you have to stop growing that. So I guess a better example here is the tobacco hornworm or the squash vine borer. Tobacco hornworms feed on solanaceous.
Share screen. Oh, apparently I hit share screen. I don't share screen.
Okay. Sorry, I just unmuted myself. Someone muted me. So you can avoid those pests by removing the crops. Something like Japanese beetle, that's not the case. They feed on almost everything. And so for some of these really damaging insects that are guaranteed to find your garden, I recommend physical exclusion. And so let's see, here we go. And so that can be something as fancy as these like official insect tunnels that you put up in the garden. And so some of these are a lightweight fabric. Some of them are actually screen mesh, or you can build this at home with extra PVC pipe or flexible stakes and sort of tool or something from the fabric store. But you're physically putting a barrier here so that these larger feeding pests cannot get on to the crop. And then when you need to get in there and access the crop, or you need it to be pollinated, you can open up the ends of that. It's really the best way, I think, to control cucumber beetles if you're trying to do cucurbit production without having to resort to chemicals. It's also really good to keep some of those brassica caterpillars off of your crops. So that's what you see here. Imported cabbage worm, cabbage looper, cross-striped cabbage worm. These will feed on broccoli, cauliflower, kale, lots of different leafy greens. And if you put a cover over it, these adults can't get access to the plant and lay their eggs. And so you are eliminating that potential. Here are the cucumber beetles that you're excluding. These are much larger, so you can use a larger mesh size. Flea beetles are another one. They are pretty damaging on our leafy greens. They will feed on tomatoes and eggplant as well. But that damage isn't on the fruit itself, it's on the leaves. And so sometimes you can tolerate a little more of that. But to keep them off your leafy greens, using exclusion covers is a really good strategy. And then we have biological control. And so this is where we have a couple different strategies. We can promote and conserve the natural enemies that are already in the environment, or we can purchase natural enemies and add them to the system. But in both of those situations, you need to understand the relationship between the natural enemy and the pest and other resources that those enemies may utilize. So one of the really good ways to help promote natural enemies in your garden is through diversification. So having a lot of different plants and resources available. This is because many of our natural enemies don't only feed on prey insects, but they also feed on floral resources like pollen and nectar. So having those diverse resources available provides sustenance and food in between times when the pest population is low. And that's the other thing, is that you have to have the pest present to support the natural enemy. So this is where I say eradication is not an option if you're relying on biological control. You have to have some level of tolerance for the food to be around for those natural enemies to feed on. So one that will naturally find its way to your garden is this parasitoid wasp of tomato and tobacco hornworms. And so each one of these little white cocoons here is a new parasitoid that will emerge from that caterpillar and mate and then go and sting another caterpillar. If you have these hornworms in your garden, you are likely to find the wasps. They take a little bit longer to show up, but they always travel around with them. So when you see this in the garden, you should leave it because you're help promoting that natural enemy. And just as a side note, here's that frass that I was talking about, those little grenades that they make. Another really great generalist natural enemy are lacewings. So in this situation, the larvae are the predators, which you see over here. They feed on soft-bodied insects, really good at feeding on aphids. But the adults themselves feed a little bit on pollen and nectar, but they don't do any pest suppression. So this is where having floral resources available is really important to sustain and establish these beneficial populations. And it's also important to be able to recognize each of these stages as the same insect. This is a picture of their eggs here. They lay them on a stalk on the plant. And the egg is on the top here. You can actually see this one just hatching and crawling out of the egg, but they're spread out on this stalk because if there isn't food around, they will cannibalize each other. So they have evolved to lay their eggs spatially, separating them and putting them up on this protective pedestal. Lady beetles are another great predator. We have a lot of native and non-native species that occur in Indiana. The larvae and the adults in this case feed on prey items. So you're getting pest suppression from both of those life stages. They lay their eggs in clusters. They're usually this dark golden yellow color, and they're oval shaped, but sort of laid on their head, so they're tall. From these eggs, these little larvae hatch and they'll get bigger and bigger as they feed on prey. And before they become adults, they go through this pupal stage. So here you have on my fertilizer tank, the larvae have crawled on and latched on. They glue themselves to this tank. Then they create this pupal protective case. And from this case emerges the adults. So all of these life stages of lady beetles. The minute pirate bug, again here, both the nymphs and the adults are predators. They will feed on aphids, thrips, mites, even small caterpillars. They are really abundant in Indiana, usually come August and September. You'll find them all over. They also feed on pollen, so having floral resources is another way to help promote their colonization in the garden. And in fall, when they get really abundant, you will notice they bite like crazy. So they'll land on your arm and it's a little black speck, and you can feel them actually piercing you with their like needle-like mouth parts. The next ones are Cyripid flies or Hoverflies. These are one of my favorites, but you really got to look to see the predation that they're doing in the garden. Sometimes they can be a bit annoying. The adults themselves like to congregate around people and lap up sweat. Here at a field day, they're all over this gentleman's hat. But the larvae in this situation are predators, and the adults to some extent can contribute to pollination. So you're benefiting from two different life stages of this insect. And so the larvae, again, they're little like maggots essentially on the undersides of leaves. They just kind of slug along, but they eat aphids like crazy. And if you get a high aphid infestation in your garden, next time flip over that leaf and really look for these little, they're either green or brown, little slug looking fly larvae. And that's the adult. Spiders. So just a general nod here to spiders. They are really great. Here you can see this salticid or jumping spider is feeding on a corn rootworm beetle. So spiders are good because they will eat larger prey items. So a lot of the beetle pests, they're not specific. They're generalist in their consuming of prey items, so they won't go voraciously after one particular beetle and manage that, but promoting spiders in general will help with pest suppression. And so there's two different ways that you can do that. One of them is by creating habitat for something like jumping spiders that actively hunt. They don't build webs. Having ground cover and having structural complexity in your garden provides this habitat for them to move in and out of and hunt in. The other ones are web building spiders. And so again, having some structural complexity for them to build their webs and to catch the prey. They're often feeding and foraging at night, so you may not necessarily see them. And another one that's busy at night eating pests in your garden are ground beetles. So ground beetles during the day are not very active, and they're usually hiding in vegetation. And so this is where this idea of beetle banks come from. Having some fairly permanent undisturbed vegetation neighboring the garden, some pretty thick ground cover, provides the habitat for these ground beetles to nest in and live in. And at nighttime, they will come out and they will forage in the garden and forage for prey, and some of them even will climb up plants. And then we have a whole slew of what we call true bug or hemipteran natural enemies. And so these natural enemies have piercing, sucking mouth parts. And you'll find them in the garden. They feed on a lot of different pests. This one here is the spined soldier bug, so related to stink bugs, and it feeds on caterpillars in particular. This is a nabbed bug. Here is a stilt bug, which feeds on caterpillar eggs. And here's a big-eyed bug. So all of these are closely related to our pests in terms of belonging to the group Hemiptera, and they have these piercing, sucking mouth parts, but they're not piercing and sucking and feeding on plant juices. They're piercing other insects and eating them. So all great to have in the garden. But you really need to be able to identify and distinguish them, right? So you want to know who you're looking for. So again, here is that spined soldier bug, which is a beneficial predatory insect, has bright orange legs, very pointed spines on its back here, and this black vertical stripe on its wings. You don't want to confuse that with the brown marmorated stink bug, which is an invasive pest. It's larger in size and it has very different distinctive markings on it. And then parasitoids. So we mentioned, and I showed you the one that was on the caterpillar earlier, but there's also a lot of parasitoids that will feed on aphids. So being able to recognize what those aphids look like to be able to determine if you need to intervene or not, because you have this natural enemy here that's potentially controlling them. And so what you're seeing here is the underside of a pepper leaf that is covered in aphids, and the light greenish yellow ones are aphids that are still alive and feeding. And all of these bronze covered and bloated ones are what we call aphid mummies. And so they have actually been parasitized by these tiny little wasps here. You can see how small they are compared to the aphid. So very small wasps. They will lay their offspring directly one inside of that aphid. And this female can do this to hundreds of aphids. That offspring will develop and eat the aphid from the inside out. And what's left is this outer shell or the mummy. And when the wasp emerges, it chews a little hole. So you'll see this bloated sort of carcass left behind that the parasites came out of. And so these are really common. This is a picture of some okra in my garden that got infested by aphids, but I never had to do anything because the wasps came shortly after the aphids did and parasitized almost every single one of them. And so what you can see here on the buds are some aphids, some ants that are tending those aphids and eating the honeydew, but a lot of empty mummies from the parasitism. And again, here's that caterpillar that's been parasitized by a wasp. And as a very last resort, so if you cannot establish natural enemies in the garden, or you're growing a crop that you have a very low tolerance for pest injury on, and you need that crop to be pristine, then we can turn to pesticides. And today I'm talking a little bit about organic pesticides in particular. This is a lot of what you can find like over the counter at your local garden store. And they are easier to access, but they're still pesticides. And so that's my point. They're still chemicals. We still need to follow labels. And so an organic pesticide is determined to be organic by a certifying body. So one of the most common ones is OMRI listed pesticides, but you can also find some of these active ingredients that are not OMRI certified, so they don't have to be organic. But they include things like Bacillus thuringiensis, pyrethrums, which are chemicals derived from chrysanthemum flowers, rotenone, which is derived from a tropical plant, insecticidal soaps, diatomaceous earth, azadirachtin or neem oil, both of which come from the neem tree. This can also include things like entomopathogenic nematodes. So teeny tiny little nematodes or worm-like critters that feed on insects. And some fungal pathogens, so Bavaria is an example of that, and horticultural oils. So these are some of the types of what we call active ingredients, or the chemical in these organic pesticides that actually do the killing on the insect. But again, these are still chemicals. You really need to read the label, wear proper personal protective equipment, limit the number of applications according to what the label says so that you don't develop resistance. I think there's a misconception sometimes that biological pesticides or organic pesticides can't, resistance can't develop to them, and that's just not true. So make sure that you're using them properly. Here's a snapshot of some of the over-the-counter stuff you can find at like Lowe's or Ace Hardware. So 7 Ortho spray, Dr. Earth, and this insecticidal super soap from Bonide. And so if we look at what these products are, I've put them into a table here so you can just compare and get sort of a snapshot of what's available. So 7 is a conventional pesticide. The active ingredient in that is zeta-cypermethrin. The next column that I'm showing you here is it safe for pets? This is something you want to know if you're applying it in your backyard. If you have dogs and cats or wildlife, 7 is not safe for pets. So you have to make sure you keep your pet out of that area when you apply it. And if you look at the label of 7, the targeted pests is everything. So that may be good if you have a lot of different pests that you're trying to kill. You don't have to have a lot of different products, but you also have to recognize that that means that it's also going to harm beneficial insects and pollinators in the garden. It has a pretty broad mode of action in the way that it kills insects. So you can't target a specific insect group with this chemistry. This Ortho insect mite and disease control spray is Sulfur. Again, this one is, even though it's organic, it's not safe for pets, and it targets things like aphids, beetles, caterpillars, and flies. And so understanding also from the label the way that this works, you have to cover the plant material with it in order to get that protection. And then here we have oils and soaps. Oils are safe for pets, so if your dog or cat eats it, they're not going to get sick. Soap, not safe. Both of these, the way that they kill the insect is through physically covering and suffocating them. So as you're applying these, you need to be aware that the insect has to be present. And when you're spraying it, however you're doing that, it has to physically cover the insect body, or it's not going to kill them. So if you sprayed it on a leaf with the intention that the insect will crawl across that leaf and then die, that's not true. It doesn't work like that for these. And so these are all things to consider. Some general thoughts. Again, the label is the law, so please make sure you're reading the labels and you're following the directions in terms of when to apply it, who it can control, and what crops to put it on. Do not use landscape products on edible crops. They have not been evaluated for safety in consuming that plant. So even if it is the same active ingredient, make sure that you're using a product labeled for edible crops, and always use caution. Lastly, I have some resources here, and I would love to just take questions or hear from some of our attendees in terms of what they use and don't use, or strategies they like in the garden. So we have a consumer horticulture website from Purdue Extension. I mentioned we have a vegetable and a fruit website with a pretty comprehensive photo gallery to help with diagnosis, and then the Purdue Plant Diagnostic Lab. And I hope that people have some comments or questions.
Yeah, it's very nice, Laura. I love your descriptions of mummies and so forth. And I would like to give a shout out to the Pest and Diagnostic Lab. I sent 2 weeks ago a sample of an alfalfa field that we didn't know what was going on, one of the producers, and it was anthracnose, and which was new to us. I know it's been around, but it hasn't been a real big problem for us. So without their help, we probably wouldn't know it. And Dr. Keith Johnson wants a follow-up information on more of what happened and the circumstances. So great thing. Cost $11 and the shipping. So
yeah, they're really, really great. And they give it to all the different specialists on campus. So if it's an insect on a fruit or vegetable that if they don't know it, it comes to me or my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Long.
yeah, and we also have a late flight of armyworms up here in the ag fields. A lot of the cover crops and alfalfa, and just weeks ago yet they were still eating. So it was an unusual year for us on some of our pests. You didn't have any armyworms shown in your
No. I see there is one question in the chat here from Allen County Soil and Water. What is an example of structural complexity in the garden to benefit spiders? So if you're looking for hunting spiders, having things like loose straw mulch on the soil surface, they can hide underneath that. Or having like a low growing herb that will provide that ground cover. And then, you know, if you're growing next to that, something like a tall tomato or a bean plant where they can get up into the canopy of that plant and hide in those broad leaves. And so sometimes if you think about, I mean, to contrast that, in a high tunnel situation where we're vertically trellising plants and really intensively pruning them, we remove all that vegetation from the bottom. So you essentially have like this bare stalk with some material up on top. In that case, you're not going to have spiders moving up that stem to get into where that canopy is.
It sounds like a good place for cover crops there.
Yeah, I was going to say the next question in here says, can a cover crop count as a rotation crop for potato in the summer and radish broadcast in the fall? Maybe one of you want to answer that. In my mind, a cover crop, it just means keeping something growing and living on the soil. And so if you're trying to rotate like away from potato pests, yes, that works because Colorado potato beetle don't feed on radish. But Mike, you wanna?
Well, I am a great proponent on my ag ground of cover crops. I started that in the early 90s. So I'm planting my crops, my corn and soybeans, into standing cereal rye and other Austrian winter peas, clover, on and on. Some of them last year were the height of my tractor cab, so or tractor hood and up to the cab. So planting in that. Cover crops have a lot of different attributes that they can shelter animals, but they also have the biocontrol of the mustards, the brassicas have a lot of good things that they can do. Not too much experience with gardening, but there's all kinds of readily available ones that are easy to grow.
Yes. So Cheryl added to that, you want to grow potatoes in the same spot every year. Cover cropping will not disrupt that life cycle because in the off season, when you'd be growing that radish in the winter, the beetle's not actually feeding, right? It's in this like diapausing resting stage in winter. And so when it comes back out in the spring and is looking for that potato resource, you would have that resource back in the garden. There are things you can do, like treatments with entomopathogenic nematodes that can, so that is like a little worm that you drench into the soil and they will eat those pupae or any stage of an insect that's residing in the soil. So that's something you can do in the fall or really early in the spring to help suppress that population that's overwintering in the soil.
Yeah, rotation is one of the greatest things that we have, and it's necessary, especially in the ag ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ramy says, you didn't mention much about Whitefly Ipm. Oh, in the greenhouses. Okay, Whitefly. So Whitefly greenhouse production in particular has a very robust biological control program available to help manage that pest. And so when it comes to whiteflies, they have sort of a very diverse life cycle as well. You have the adult that is active and flying around laying eggs. You have this nymph that moves just for a short period. Then you get this like resting stage that just sits and feeds I tried to not work on whiteflies. My colleague Elizabeth, Dr. Long, works on whiteflies. But so there are a lot of predators available. So one of them that's used a lot in greenhouse production is a parasitoid wasp called Incarcia formosa. And so this is a little wasp. You can actually buy the like wasps on these little cards. They've already parasitized, like the adults are about ready to emerge when you buy it, and you hang this card on the plant, and then the adults will come out of that, forage around, find those whiteflies and sting them. So that one is really common. There's also a predatory beetle that you can buy that will feed on them. I think a predatory mite as well. So yeah, that the industry has a very good system for whitefly biocontrol, but the first step is really getting that parasitoid Incarcia. How do you know the best time to introduce beneficials for maximum control? Okay, this is tricky. So again, you have to recognize that when you are putting a beneficial natural enemy into an environment, you have to have some level of prey there for that insect to be feeding on in order for it to stay in the habitat. But if you have an explosion of the pest population where they're just dripping off the plant, your beneficials are not going to be able to get that under control. So early intervention, sometimes even preventatively, if you purchase the beneficial insects in a way that they come with the supplemental food to help them sustain themselves before the pest moves into the crop. But you have to recognize that if you're doing it preventatively, you're going to have to keep reintroducing these natural enemies. But usually early in pest establishment, so it means they're there, you can consistently find them when you're scouting the crop, but they're not overwhelming and killing the plant. And it really depends on that situation in terms of what beneficial you're putting out. Predatory mites usually do better in that early low population stage. And again, that's because you can buy them with these little breeding sachets. So there's some food available for them and they take longer to disperse. The other thing is having those floral resources present before the pest is there. So if you want to do early introductions of things like lacewings, lady beetles, or the pirate bug, or promote them into the garden, having flowers present is going to help. They have something to feed on in between those pest meals. And so that's where things like buckwheat or sweet alyssum, or just paying attention to those floral resources and having them staggered so there's flowers constantly on the landscape can really help sustain those populations.
Okay, any other questions? You guys are welcome to unmute and talk directly too if you got a conversation to go. It's always the best thing. The floral controls, the flowers can be, I love the clovers also are a great thing.
Yeah.
Low down to the ground.
We've used Gomphrena. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Gomphrena. It is a like bouquet filler, fresh cut flower. It flowers and then grows and flowers and grows and flowers, and you can cut it back, but it just blooms all year long. And it has these really small, it kind of looks like a clover flower to me, the purple ones, but it's a great resource and the insects really, really love them.
Maybe you could put that one on our chat board and
Yeah.
give a good resource for people. So it's really important to understand the life cycle because some of these are very short life cycles. If you have to hit them early or get them early, because otherwise it just continues on. They go around.
Yeah. And especially for the pests that have multiple generations, something like squash bugs that people get really upset about in the fall, because you have thousands of them. You have to recognize they are present in the spring. You just have to look for them. And if you don't intervene early, that population just builds and builds and builds, and then it's too late, really.
Well, any other questions right now, or we can move on to Marissa, our next one, and we can cycle back. Oh, I see you got a few more. Oh, that's you putting it on there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, what can I do if I get squash bugs in my compost? I don't know. Squash bugs are really tough. There aren't a lot of natural enemies that go after them, and really using something like insecticidal soaps or pyrethrins on the nymphs is the best way to manage them. If you get them in your compost, bury them with more non-squash compost and hopefully they die. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It sounds like a job for the heat, the natural heat.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Maybe they'll get cooked in there. Well, thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me directly.
Okay. Very good. You're going to be leaving us now?
I have another meeting in 9 minutes, so I'll hang out for a little bit. But yeah, I have to take off. Okay. Sorry about that.
Thank you for sharing. That was a great presentation.
You're welcome.
So let's move on to Marissa Renz from Fort Wayne here. She's a local gardener and educator, and let's hear what we can learn from her.
Good morning. Thanks, Mike. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Okay, as Mike said, I am here in Fort Wayne. I live not too far from PFW in Northside neighborhood. My husband and I live on about 1/3 of an acre, and we're gardening about 1/3 of that. So our intensively gardened areas are about 4,000 square feet. My intention with my space is really to push it as much as I can to grow as much food for myself as I can. But I've also, over the last few years, been incorporating a lot of plantings to attract beneficials, as Laura was talking about, so that I can really rely more heavily on the biological controls and the beneficial insects that can really be my ally, hopefully, during the growing season. So we grow, let's see if I can get it to change here. We grow a lot of food. This year we had about 20 different varieties of food. Both annuals and perennials. So we have strawberry, rhubarb, asparagus, garlic, carrots. We've even been dabbling in mushrooms the last few years, which has been really fun. Lots of different herbs, leafy greens. Let's see, what else do we have growing out there? Even some native plants that are edible, like Jerusalem artichokes. So in addition to growing these food sources, I'm also focused on planting for pollinators and beneficial insects. A lot of the plants that I use are native plants. So plants that are more in sync, I guess, with the insects that we have in our area, that have evolved over the years with the insects, and the life cycles are really in sync with the bloom times, and trying to attract a lot of those to the gardens, both for pollination services and also for some pest protection. Because we're growing a lot of food, we do see a fair amount of pests in our landscape. This is my eggplant from this year. And I was out scouting around in the garden early in the season, finding some of the Colorado potato beetle eggs on the undersides of the leaves. And I was just going through and wiping the leaves off, trying to get rid of the eggs. And there were some that I missed along the way. So I was finding various stages, like Laura was talking about with some of the other insects of the potato beetle on my eggplant. And I would just wipe them off and throw them into the lawn, hoping they'll become a meal for something else at some point. My eggplant also did have some flea beetle damage, but the eggplant rebounded pretty well from the flea beetles, and we still had copious amounts of eggplant that we were able to harvest over the season. I do also get flea beetles like on my kale, turnip greens, those types of things. I do sell at markets sometimes. So if I'm, taking that food to the market, I would be more hesitant to take any of those that really have a lot of damage from the flea beetles. But my husband and I don't mind eating them because even though there's some damage there, it's still is pretty good food, and it doesn't really alter the taste too much. So those are two pests that we get. We also get the squash beetles, squash borer, aphids, the cabbage white butterfly, the caterpillars, Japanese beetles. I see cucumber beetles, asparagus beetles. So because we're planting so many different food crops, we are attracting a lot of different pests. And another one of my focuses in the garden really is to also provide space for the beneficial insects. So the assassin bugs, the spiders, the wasps, dragonflies, praying mantis, lady beetles, soldier beetles. There are spaces in my garden that I'm really trying to use as habitat so that I can encourage those to come back every year, so that I can hopefully rely on them a little more. They see things that I don't see in the garden, especially with some of the very tiny pests. So it's nice to have them as an ally working in the garden when I'm not able to see some of those pests, especially in some of the early stages of their development. So I'm really focused on creating habitat around the garden in order to try to help with some of the pest issues. And in addition, it really just provides good space for our pollinators, and for a lot of the beneficial insects that can be predators as well. Most of us are probably aware that our pollinators are in some trouble as far as, the population numbers and habitat. So the more that we can do in urban spaces, suburban spaces, there are lots of different options where we can utilize some of the same techniques in order to kind of help with some of these bigger issues. So I'm really looking at creating some habitat in my space. And in creating habitat, some of the things I need to look at are providing water and food sources, areas where the insects can take cover and also do some nesting, and areas that are really low maintenance. So places that I'm not overly manicuring, pruning things back, really cleaning things up. Those are the areas that the insects are really going to be attracted to. And also the birds as well, which can be of benefit in some pest control in the garden spaces as well. So looking at water sources, insects, just like us, just like our pets, when it gets hot and dry out, they need a water source. And I really like to try to utilize some of the plants in our space if I can to try to help capture some of that water. One of the plants that I really love to use is the cup plant, which is the picture here on the left at the top. The cup plant is a prairie plant. It's a very robust, gets very large, has really large leaves that form a cup around the stem. And those cups actually collect water when it rains. So those are little spaces that the insects can get into, and even birds sometimes will get into to get sips of water when it's hot and dry. Additionally, the cup plant is a really great plant for attracting beneficial insects and pollinators. You can see there's a swallowtail butterfly on it. It's very tolerant of a lot of different conditions. It can handle wet areas, dry areas, clay soil. It's a very robust plant and is a little more aggressive, so it's not ideal for small spaces. But if you have a larger area that you're working with, and you maybe don't mind the reseeding as much, it's a plant that is really great to incorporate for like hedgerows or insectary plantings. I also like to use little water dishes around the garden. I'll put some rocks and things in there so that there's a little bit of a slope. Makes it a little bit easier for the insects to crawl in and get a drink of water and then fly back out. Bird baths are also a great option. A friend of mine here took a picture of her bird bath that had a bunch of little bees lined up getting a drink on a hot summer day. So providing some areas where there is some water access for the insects can be very helpful as well. Looking at food sources, as Laura mentioned, insects have a really diverse diet, and it can depend on which part of their life cycle that they're in, what it is they're going to be either hunting for or looking for as a food source. Having flowers in the garden, a diverse variety of flowers, things that are blooming all through the season, so we don't have any gaps during the growing season, can be really great for attracting different insects at different times of year. And in my garden, even though I'm growing for food and I don't want to have too many pests, as she mentioned, having some of those pests will keep the predators coming back. So like the tobacco hornworm or the tomato hornworm, caterpillar there, if I don't have those, then I'm not going to have the wasps coming in to help take care of those caterpillars that may be in and around the garden that I'm not seeing. Having the Cyripid flies, as she mentioned, I think she was saying that those eat aphids at various stages of their life. Wasps are also really great in the garden. Most of us have a little bit of a fear of wasps, I think, but I find that if they're on our flowers, they're really pretty docile. If we're around their nest, that can be a different story, but in their adult stage, generally when they're feeding, they are feeding on pollen and nectar. Oftentimes, if they're hunting for caterpillars, those they may actually be taking back to their nesting sites. So having different types of flowering plants can also be really great in attracting different wasps, which can be great predators in the garden. Also for our pollinators, for our bees, they really only eat pollen and nectar, and that's what they also use to take back to their nests when they're building their nests for the next generation. So the more flowering plants, the more pollen and nectar we can provide, the more diverse our insect populations can be in our gardens. And having different food sources for the insects at different stages of their lives. So the swallowtail butterfly as an adult will feed just on pollen and nectar. But the females will lay their eggs on specific host plants. I think primarily for the swallowtail, it's those in the carrot family. So like celery, carrots, dill, Queen Anne's lace, I think is another one, golden Alexander. So that when the caterpillars are developing, they have specific leaves that they need to eat in order to transform and become more mature and then become adult butterflies. So this middle picture is an early instar of a swallowtail caterpillar on some celery leaves. And then the picture to the right is maybe a third or fourth instar, so more developed before they spin their chrysalis and then emerge as a butterfly where they're back to eating the pollen and the nectar on the flowers. Several years ago, I was reading Douglas Ptolemy's book, Bringing Nature Home. And he does a lot of research specifically on birds and looking at the diet of birds and then looking at the insects that provide food sources for the birds. And usually that, in his research anyway, has been a lot revolved around caterpillars. Caterpillars are a really important part of bird diets, especially baby birds. That's what most of them eat. So I just was very interested in the book. He was looking at different trees and those trees that could be host plants for different butterfly species. So I just started to wonder what like the flower power in my garden was and what function the plants were providing that were in my gardens. So I just picked 6, goldenrod, aster, cardinal flower, black-eyed Susan, and then a couple types of milkweed, and started researching the different insects that were attracted to those specific plants and just started building a food web out to see what that food web could look like. So in my small space, I was just looking at 6 plants, and you can see how kind of diverse and complex the food web has become just with 6 plants. So if you start adding more plants to that, or think of an area like Eagle Marsh or maybe a nature preserve where there are lots of different native plants, that food web gets really gets a lot more complex And the more complex the food web is, the more options there are for food sources, the stronger it really is. If we're growing like a monoculture crop in our garden, if we only have tomatoes, and our tomatoes get decimated by the tomato hornworm, that doesn't really leave us with many tomatoes. But if we're growing tomatoes and carrots and beets and chard and a lot of other things, if the tomato hornworm does show up in our garden and does decimate our tomatoes, at least we'll have other food sources then that we can rely on. I think that idea also exists in a kind of a natural food web. So the more diverse our plantings, the more diverse the insects are, the less likely maybe of a collapse in any one area. If we have a plant maybe that doesn't make it, or an insect population that dies off, there are lots of other things for other insects to eat, other birds to eat, and so on. So as I said, I just have 6 plants here, and it really starts to become complex. And this isn't even a complete list. So if I were to really dive in and add lots of more insects that are attracted to these, it would probably become a lot more complex. So the flowers that we are choosing for our gardens, I'm getting a lot of sunlight here, are of importance. Not all flowers provide the same function or the same benefit in our gardens. One of the things that's really key is to try to make sure that we have flowers blooming the entire season. So from spring until fall, we don't have any gaps, so that we're constantly attracting pollinators, we're attracting the beneficials, and there's always a food source available for them so that they don't leave and look for food sources somewhere else. Bees primarily see blue, purple, and yellow. So if we're planting for the bees, those are kind of the colors that we would want to stick to. Not that they will never find like a red bee balm or a red cone flower, but it's not going to be as easy for them to locate those because they're not seeing those colors. In addition, for the beneficial insects, some of the research that I've read, and even observing in my gardens, white flowers and very small yellow flowers are often very attractive to a lot of the beneficial insects, especially the wasps. So kind of keeping in those color palettes, and keeping the flowers in the colors that they are naturally. So most cone flowers, I think the native cone flowers are going to be purple, and there may be some yellow ones too. But some of, the horticulture industry has tweaked some of the colors so that we have orange blooming and yellow blooming, white blooming, a variety of shades that really aren't as attractive to the insects and don't provide as much function as far as food sources go, or them being able to find them in the gardens. So kind of keeping those colors primarily in the garden will be of more benefit to our pollinators. Having a variety of shapes and sizes. We have bumblebees that can be as big as a quarter, and then some of our beneficials and pollinators are so small that you may need a microscope to see them. So having flowers of all different shapes and sizes, again, will just add to the diversity of the insects that then can also be attracted to your garden. Pollinators' mouths sort of fit with flowers like puzzle pieces, and that they can't access all the pollen and nectar from all of the flowers. It really depends on what their mouth is shaped like and what sort of tongue they have. So for the bees, there are long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. Long-tongued bees, like this bumblebee over on the right here, that bumblebee probably has a long tongue, and it's able to stick its tongue down deeper into the blue lobelia there and reach the pollen and the nectar a little more easily. A short-tongued bee probably wouldn't be able to access the pollen and nectar from that flower quite as easily. But a short-tongued bee could easily access the pollen and nectar from coneflowers, or from sunflowers, or maybe from daisies, maybe even from cilantro. So having different shaped flowers will provide again, just diversity for the different types of pollinators that will end up visiting our gardens. And as Laura mentioned, there are specialists and generalists. So like the monarch butterfly is a specialist, for instance. The caterpillars require the milkweed to forage on, to eat, so that they can grow and mature and then become monarch butterflies. So without the milkweed, we won't have any monarch butterflies. But like the swallowtail butterfly can lay its eggs on golden Alexander, carrots, dill. So its diet is a little bit more general and not quite as narrow as like the monarch is, which is why having a lot of diverse plantings could be beneficial and attract various pollinators and also beneficial insects as well. My focus initially, when I really started getting into gardening, I suppose, when I was really piqued my interest when I was at IPFW, was looking at native plants and the function that they can play in our watersheds primarily. The more that I was researching, the more I was finding that, wow, like native plants provide a lot more benefit than just water quality. They actually have some closely synced relationships with our insect species as well. And not all of them are equal in the function that they can provide. So this list that I put on here is from the book that I have listed here, Pollinators of Native Plants by Heather Holm, which is sort of my pollinator Bible, if you will. It has lots of great information in it about pollinators, and then a good chunk of it is primarily about native plants. And a lot of those are specific for our area as well. So I just did kind of a snapshot of some of the plants that she had listed in the book. And a lot of these are ones that I grow in my garden. So looking like at the milkweed, there are different varieties of milkweed, but you can see here that just between the swamp milkweed and the butterfly milkweed, that the function that they play in terms of the insects that they attract are actually a little bit different. So the swamp milkweed attracts 11 beneficial insects, and the butterfly milkweed attracts just 3. The swamp milkweed attracts 8 native pollinators, and the butterfly milkweed actually attracts 12. And they're both host plants for 13 butterfly species, and both attract honeybees as well. So not only are they a host plant for the monarch butterfly, but they can provide some extra benefit in the garden in terms of attracting other insects as well. Prairie coreopsis, clover, rattlesnake master is another one that I have in my garden that I love. Also attracts a lot of beneficial insects and native pollinators, and also honeybees. Bee balm or wild bergamot is another great one. Also attracts a lot of bumblebees, and I like to plant that one near my tomatoes. I get a lot of bumblebees foraging on the bergamot, and then also on my tomatoes as well. And then let's see, scrolling down here to like goldenrod, which is often thought of as a weed, but it actually is a really important plant in the landscape, especially late in summer or early in fall, when a lot of wasp species especially are foraging on the goldenrod. A lot of bumblebees and even monarchs will use that as a food source as they are traveling south for the winter. But you can see it attracts 11 beneficial insects, 10 native pollinators. It also attracts honeybees and is a host plant for 110 different butterfly species. So just by incorporating different plants, having a lot of diversity, you can pull in a lot of different insects, which can be really beneficial in your garden spaces, especially if you're growing food. One of the resources that I use quite a bit is wildflower.org. That's the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website. And you can go to that website and type in cup plant, type in butterfly milkweed, and it lists all of the different functions that these plants play, from attracting beneficial insects, attracting native pollinators, if the plants are a good resource for nesting material for pollinators, if the birds eat them, if they're host plants. There's just a ton of really great information. So if you're interested in and want to get a little nerdier about the plants that are in your garden and the functions that they're playing, I would definitely recommend looking around on that website to see what you can find. The National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, you can go to that website and plug in your zip code, and it will actually give you a list of host plants for butterflies. And I think they sorted out by which ones are the highest number. So like for mine, it was actually goldenrod for perennials, attracting 110 different Lepidoptera species. So just different ways that you can find out about different functions of plants, and kind of figure out what you want to incorporate into your garden spaces and what would provide the best level of function for your space. Some other plant options that I like to use, perennials, especially herbs, sage, lavender, thyme. White yarrow is a really great addition as well. I do have pink yarrow growing in my garden, and I've found that the white really attracts a lot more beneficials, especially than the pink. I don't see as much action on the pink. So sometimes some of the tweaking that's been done on the plants has an impact on our pollinators. So just something that's good to keep in mind. If we can keep what we're planting as true to its origin as possible, that can also be more helpful. Some biennials that I like to use are parsley, carrots, and parsnip. So I will grow these the first year and harvest. So this year I planted all 3 of these, growing them through the season and then harvesting them throughout the season. And then I'm going to keep them in the ground over the winter. I'll continue to harvest as much as I can, probably still be able to harvest some in the spring. And then I will actually allow some of these to bolt or go to flower because they attract a lot of different beneficials. The parsley especially, it is one of the most active plants in my garden during the summer when it's in bloom. An amazing amount of beneficial insects come to that. So if you can find spaces where you can leave some of these things to finish their life cycle, it can be of benefit in terms of the ecosystem maybe that we're trying to build or building that habitat. Some annuals that are great: cilantro, dill, basil, sweet alyssum, marigolds, and zinnia, which are really great for butterflies and also bumblebees. And then some cover crops that I like to use: radish, buckwheat, and crimson clover. And radish I will often let bolt during the season, and it attracts a lot of the little Cyripid hoverflies. So I do end up seeing quite a few of those in the garden over the season. Buckwheat is one of my favorites. So I use that. Initially, I started using it just to attract beneficial insects, but then I was pleased to find out that it provides some other great benefits, keeping phosphorus in the soil and just having something growing in those spaces where I don't have crops actively growing also helps, the overall soil health. And then crimson clover is a really lovely addition to the garden. The color is really vibrant. It attracts a lot of beneficials. And it was really just an eye catcher. And some of these can be used in ornamental beds as well. They don't all have to be right in the vegetable garden, but I do like to make sure that they are planted near the vegetable garden so that the beneficials and the pollinators don't have to travel very far to get food. They can come in either to find maybe caterpillars or to find pollen and nectar, and it's pretty easy trip for them, moving back and forth across the garden. In terms of habitat, I think oftentimes when we hear the word ecosystem or hear the word habitat, we think of areas like Eagle Marsh or like a rainforest in Costa Rica, that it has to be this really pristine space that is way away from where we're living. But one of my goals really has been to incorporate this habitat in my garden so that I can provide spaces for the monarch butterfly, for the swallowtail butterfly, for the pollinators in general. And in our space, what we've done is plant some ornamental gardens that are in and around our house, in and around the flower beds. Again, with flowers that are blooming throughout the season. And then trying to keep kind of a hands-off or a low maintenance a habit in terms of how we maintain those spaces, so that those insects can freely come in and out, overwinter in those spaces, build nests in those spaces, and so that we always have them around from year to year, and not necessarily having to purchase them or bring them in from somewhere else. I'm hoping that they'll make a home here, so that we'll have them always to be our allies in the garden. So like this picture in the upper left, earlier in the season, I have red bee balm blooming, and I don't see a lot of pollinators on the red bee balm, but I do see hummingbirds, which is always good to find. And they're actually pollinators too. So once the bee balm is done later in the season, we have lots of goldenrod. And I just got done actually deadheading all of my goldenrod. There were tons of seed heads on it. And it's one that spreads prolifically. So because of the space that I'm in, I really have to make sure that I keep it in check, or I probably would have a garden filled with only goldenrod. But at the end of the season, I go through and I deadhead everything and cut the seed heads off. But I really try to leave as much of the stems as I can. I'm raking leaves into the garden beds instead of pulling them out. And just really trying not to disturb the habitat that has been created throughout the growing season. So that any bees that have nested in those areas, any other insects that are overwintering, butterflies and those things will have space that isn't getting disturbed by me coming in and actively cleaning things up or removing material. And then here on the right, some areas that are really close to my garden beds, where I have sage and lavender, butterfly milkweed, and a bunch of other native plants also incorporated in that space. So it's pretty close to where we're growing food. Those insects don't have to go very far, hopefully, to find a food source. So it's less taxing on them overall as well. In terms of nesting for pollinators and also beneficial insects, trying to keep those areas in the habitats so that they can come in and do that from year to year. I use a lot of bamboo stakes in my garden for stakes, for supports, also for building little fences. And I've found over the years that I get solitary wasps and also solitary bees that nest in these pretty freely. So that the bamboo makes a great resource for a nesting site for some of these insects as well. This little chip clip here, we use a chip clip on our mailbox to put our outgoing mail on. And last spring, I opened up the mailbox and found that a little wasp had come in and built a little nest inside of there. So somehow my mailbox also became part of the habitat for my garden space, which I was totally fine with. We took our shutters off of our house last year. They hadn't been removed in, I don't know, probably a decade or more. And the back sides of the shutters were just covered in these wasps' nests. Areas that I wouldn't probably even realize that they were nesting in, and that, they're looking for areas where they want cover, they want to be away from predators. So they're finding areas of protection that they can nest in. And they've not, been an issue for us. And I would never have known that they were actually there until we took those shutters off. So they'll find any little crevice that they can to build their nests for the future generations. This picture up on the right is a house that my husband and I lived in several years ago. This little gap behind the nest was a storm window that was open just like a half an inch. And a paper wasp, a female paper wasp, slipped in and started building a nest in that spot. And it was a really horrible place to build that nest in terms of their survival, because none of the larvae actually made it that year. But for that season, I had wasps in and out of that space all summer. So I was really able to watch them really up close and personal. It was really interesting to see them. And without having that happen, I never would have been able to watch them so closely. And I don't know that I'll get that opportunity again. It was really interesting to have them there for this season. Last year, we had a hornet's nest that showed up on the side of our house. It was about the size of a softball. And I realized that it needed to go. Hornets are great predators in the garden, but they also get very angry if you get close to their nest. And this one happened to be in an area that our postman walks by every day. Our elderly neighbor lives on that side of the house. And so I knew that it needed to go in terms of safety. So I did some research on hornets, trying to figure out a way that we could get rid of them without getting stung and without having to use like a Raid or some sort of hornet spray or something like that. So I did some research and found that soap often works really well. So we filled up a pump sprayer with some Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap. We went out at dusk. I read that usually at that time is when the queen is more likely to be in the nest. So we went out with the pump sprayer. It was like 9 o'clock or so at night, and gave it a good dousing. We went back inside just to let them calm down because they were getting a little irritated with us because we were spraying the nest. We went back out at like midnight and finished spraying it, and the whole nest just disintegrated. It just fell off of the house onto the ground. And we could see all of the cells from the nest laying on the ground. And I was actually going to go out the next day and grab some of those cells. I've got a little microscope. I was going to look at them under the microscope. But when we went out the next day, all of those cells were gone. The whole nest had been eaten by something. So I was really glad that I didn't use something stronger to spray on it, because whatever ate that nest would have also ingested whatever we sprayed on it. So it was really, I was sad because I didn't get to look at them because I was really excited to see them under the microscope. But I was glad to see that something was able to eat them. It was probably a raccoon, maybe, or a possum. And knowing that I didn't use anything too heinous, although I don't know that the Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap probably tasted very good. But sometimes soap is a really good option if you're trying to get rid of insects. And there's lots of great resources to look that stuff up so that you can maybe find some alternatives to some of the things that you can find in the shelves at the store. So one of the things that I really love about my garden, especially this point, we moved into our house in the fall of 2015, and I'm starting to feel like we're really starting to see the ecosystem developing and seeing it working in our favor. One of the things that I see every year are these redbud leaves with the little notches taken out of them. And these notches are actually removed by leafcutter bees. So leafcutter bees come in and they chew out a little piece of the leaf, and they take that leaf back to their nest, and they use that leaf to build the cells that they deposit their egg in and deposit the pollen and nectar in. So whenever I see this, I know that I have leafcutter bees somewhere around my property. Last year was the first time that I actually found a nest in the garden, and it was in one of my bamboo stakes. So I was super excited. I saw that little green cap, so I knew I had some leafcutter bees that were nesting in there. So I was very, very excited about that. And like October or November, I looked out my window and I found this downy woodpecker pecking on that one particular bamboo piece. And how that downy woodpecker knew that nest was in there, I have no idea. But it did. And it was pecking at the bamboo. I went out and looked, and there was a little hole that they drilled into the bamboo, probably pulling some of the larvae from the bees out of the bamboo. So I was a little bit sad because, it was the first time I'd actually seen one of the nests in the garden. But I was also really happy because I feel like it was sort of a full circle moment where I could see that some of the techniques that I've been using over the years are starting to connect. So not only am I able to provide food sources for the insects, but the insects then are providing a food source for the birds as well. And insects are really a pretty important part of bird diet, especially in the wintertime. A lot of the dormant insects, a lot of the eggs, they're very high fat content, and birds need high fat in their diet so that they can make it through the very cold winter months that we have. So the more of these nests that we can have, the more dormant insects that we have in and around our landscape, the more food for the birds through the winter as well, which helps their future populations the following year as well. So in my gardens, there are some areas that I really try to do as little disturbance as possible. My food beds are pretty intensively gardened, so I'm out there working the soil pretty frequently, but I try not to disrupt it too deeply. As Laura mentioned, a lot of insects will spend part of their life cycle in the soil. Some will spend it closer to the surface of the soil, some in deeper layers of the soil. So when I cultivate, I really try to do just a shallow cultivation. I don't do any tilling. So I try to make sure whatever I do is just at a superficial level. I don't remove the plant roots. This picture up on the left here is actually an okra plant from last year. I just cut it down just a couple inches above the ground level and left the rest of it to decompose in the garden. In the spring then, you can see there was still a little bit of the stalk left there. I had added compost around it as well. So in the spring, I just planted right around it. I planted onions and tomatoes. I think I had carrots that I planted around it too. And it's just really going to break down over time and feed the soil web as well. Helping to create a healthier soil over time also. I do cover crop. I cover crop, I usually broadcast a little bit later maybe than you do, Mike, just because I have a smaller space that I'm working with. Our garden is in the front yard, so I want to keep it a little more under control. So I've been seeding cover crops maybe mid to late September, just so I get some active growth. I want roots in the ground. I want a little bit on the surface of the soil, but I don't really want it to get it too tall at the end of the season. And having that, the roots, having the vegetation on top of the soil all just helps to protect the soil. Also helping to protect any insects that may be overwintering in those spaces as well. I do try to leave as much organic matter as possible. So when I'm deadheading in the fall, if I'm deadheading like the gardens I showed earlier with the bee balm and the goldenrod, I try to leave as much of the stems as I can. A lot of pollinators will actually nest in stems. So if we can leave stems, those will actually be nesting sites for next year's pollinators. Any stems that we might be removing this year out of the garden may actually have active nests in them. So we're actually removing future pollinators, next year's pollinators from our garden if we're cleaning them out in the fall. So trying to leave as much of that as I can. It is a delicate balance. Too much organic matter can mean that you have things like slugs that show up, which can be really difficult to get rid of. That is something that I do battle with in the spring every year. This year I planted, I think, 80 pepper plants, and I ended up with 60 when all was said and done because the slugs just really decimated them. Even the habaneros, which I would have thought they would have avoided. So mostly, you know, if I'm pulling organic matter or leaves into the garden beds, those are usually my like my perennial beds where I'm growing the native plants or the herbs or those types of things. My food beds are a little bit cleaner. I don't put as much organic matter in those, but I also try not to take too much out. So it's just finding kind of that sweet spot, that delicate balance to try to have the ecosystem kind of balance itself out over time. So this picture here where it says leave the leaves, I think this is a Luna moth, an overwintering Luna moth. And as you can see, that just kind of looks like a leaf, or it looks like some sort of garden debris. And, you know, if I was out working in my garden and I saw that, I probably wouldn't think much of it. But when they're overwintering, they're camouflaging themselves to try to avoid predators, and then getting themselves in a state where they can make it through the winter. And oftentimes, you know, if we're out raking or cleaning things up, we're not really going to see that unless we know what we're looking for. So leaving as much of that stuff as we can also helps the insect populations, because they have a place to overwinter and then they can emerge in the spring. This little branch here, these are all katydid eggs. And you can see they blend really nicely on that little branch. If that branch were to get thrown out, then we're also throwing away future generations of katydids as well. So as you know, as Laura mentioned, knowing the life cycles, knowing that a lot of these insects overwinter, knowing when they emerge in the spring, can really kind of help navigate how we plan our gardens, and figuring out how we want it to function, and in choosing the plants and our techniques or our gardening habits, can really be very helpful in terms of helping with the pollinators and helping with the beneficial insects. And fall is always a really hard time for me because I'm the crazy person on my block that's actually raking all of the leaves into my gardens while my neighbors are raking everything out of the gardens. And what I see when we're doing leaf pickup and cleaning out our garden spaces is just all of this potential for the future years that we're getting rid of. So the leaves that can break down and become new soil, or that have overwintering insects on them, we're actually pushing to the street, and then they're taking away to either the compost or, you know, the landfill. And those are things that if we want to develop an ecosystem, if we want to have habitat, we need to try to keep as much of that in our space as possible. And it's not always feasible. If you have a lot of trees, if you have a lot of leaves that are coming down, keeping everything is not always feasible. But my observation is that in the fall, most of us are doing our very best to clean every last leaf and stem out of our gardens. And I think that is really probably going to be detrimental over time, because we're not feeding our gardens anything natural, sort of the way nature works in like a wooded area or in a nature preserve, where all of those things fall in autumn and break down over time and become more soil and just add to the ecosystem. We're actually removing all of that in the fall. So the more of that we can keep, the better. And as I mentioned, it's a delicate balance. We have to figure out what works for the spaces that we're in. I used to think I could keep all of our leaves and all of my neighbors' leaves. I wanted them all. And I realized that that's just not realistic for our space. But I do try to keep what I can, especially with, you know, like the oak leaves and maple leaves. I find those are really great mulch for my gardens over the winter. They help to also insulate the plants. There's just tons of different good reasons to keep as much of that organic matter as we can in our garden spaces. So this is just an aerial shot from, I think it's from Google Maps, of our area. So we're on 1/3 of an acre, and just over 1/3 of that is actually in food production. So the south side of our property is our front yard, and that's where we have most of our food growing. All of the yellow lines are where we have food beds where we're intensively growing rotating crops throughout the season. The orange lines are where I have a lot of native plants, a lot of wildflowers, herbs growing. So you can see I've tried to designate those around where I have the food crops growing. The pink lines are where we've got fruit trees and other herbs growing, also other native plants. So it's a mix of both edibles and kind of insectary plantings as well. In the very backyard our dog has free rein back there and he's often chasing squirrels. So for me to try to like make that manicured in any way is not realistic at our house because he just goes crazy back there. So the backyard really is where we leave things a little untidier. It's not an area that really can be seen from the street. So I rake a lot of leaves into the garden spaces back there as well. We keep branches from trees. I'll place them strategically around the garden as well, just so we have places for organic matter to break down so that those cycles can continue. And since 2015, we've documented 37 bird species, 11 butterfly species, a whole host of pollinator and beneficial insects. I don't have a number on that yet, but I'm working to identify a lot of those. And at least 11 problematic pests on food crops, and there probably are more than that, but that's what I've been able to sort of document so far. And in our space, since 2016, we've grown almost 3,000 pounds of food. And just this year, we were at just over 900 pounds of food. And I'm still harvesting carrots and parsnips and beets. I might still have some celery out there as well. So that number is probably going to go up. And for us in a small space in a more urban or, suburban or semi-urban area, being able to grow that much food, that's food that we're able to preserve for the winter as well. So we have a lot of stuff in the freezer, a lot of things that have been dehydrated and canned. Which means that we have to rely on the grocery store less during the winter, which is a really good feeling. But you can see this year we had over 20 varieties of food, both annual and perennials. We've got 8 fruit trees, apples. We've got 2 peach trees and 2 plum trees. 2 blueberry shrubs, one that's not doing well at all and one that's actually doing really well. Not sure, they're planted fairly close to each other, but there's something in the soil that's different in those 2 spots, that one really likes it and one does not. A mix of herbs and wildflowers. We've got over 40 varieties of plant species, perennials, trees and shrubs. And then we do deal with some invasive non-native species, and most of those are coming from my neighbor who has Japanese knotweed and English ivy and a handful of other things that we're trying to keep on her side of the fence, but it does creep over to ours. Additionally, one of the things that I really advocate for in terms of urban and suburban gardens is being able to capture water. We have a lot of rainfall in our area generally, and one of the things that we sort of combat is runoff. So I'm hoping that my gardens will help to absorb a lot of the precipitation that we get in any year. I want those gardens to work more for themselves and depend on me less. That's the idea. So hopefully we'll get there at some point. But in an average year, our entire property might be exposed to 320,000 gallons of rainfall, which is not a small amount. And as much of that as I can capture with plant roots, the better, not only for my gardens, but it also decreases what runoff is moving into the sewers as well, and helping with erosion and just a whole host of other great benefits. Our front space here where we're growing most of our food gets about 80,000 gallons if we get about 38 inches of rainfall, which again, not a small amount, and those plants can definitely use every bit of that, especially so that I don't have to use the city tap to water. And if you're interested in figuring out how much rainfall your property may be exposed to, you can take the square footage of your property, multiply that times, for our area, it would be 3 for 3 feet, times 7.48 gallons per cubic foot. And you can kind of figure out how much potential rainfall your property can capture or is exposed to in a given year. And just to wrap up here, a friend of mine mentioned one time that she wanted to be an active environmentalist. She didn't want to write checks to other places. She wanted to try to make the changes where she could actually see them happening. I feel like there's so much potential in land use, not just for farmers. I think a lot of times we spend a lot of times expecting other people to make the changes for us, in terms of farmers, in terms of maybe our local government or other organizations that will help with the pollinators, or help with water quality, or help with, you know, the populations of the bird species. But these are all things that we can actually do ourselves, so that we can be actively participating in improving not only our hyper local ecosystem in and around the space where we live, but also that actually touches the greater environment as well. I think Douglas Tallamy says it best, that we really don't think of our properties, especially in urban or suburban spaces, as being areas that can sustain a lot of these plants and animals, some of which are in peril, but that used to be common throughout the US. But that's exactly the role that our landscapes are playing now. So the more that we can do to plant for these things, the better off I think the overall environment can be, most definitely. And that concludes my portion here. Thanks so much for listening.
Oh, Marissa, I have to say, we have a like mind. I spend a lot of time on my farm saying I'm not an environmental activist, I'm an active environmentalist.
Yes.
And my wife is very fond of calling my place farming ugly, because of the cover crops growing and, you know, on and on. You call it untidy, so
Yes.
I think it's the same thing.
It is. I agree.
You have one comment here on the chat room. You talked about
Mm.
birds feeding on insects through the winter.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on feeding the birds with store seed?
So it depends on the store seed that you buy. Picking seed that's higher in fat content, and oftentimes that is the black oil sunflower seeds. And those are relatively inexpensive. Wild Birds Unlimited also has suets that have like mealybugs and other insects that are incorporated into the suets. So those can also add some fat for the birds as well. Some of the mixes have like millet and some other things in them that are pretty much fillers for the birds and aren't really good for them, especially in the winter months. So any kind of like, I think the sunflower seeds are really high, any sort of insect feeders that you can get. There's some other things that are slipping my mind right now that are a little bit higher in fat as well. But Wild Birds Unlimited is a pretty good resource if you're local in town, to visit them, and they can guide you on what some of the better feeds are.
Yeah, I see Joelle's asking a question here. What are some insects you would recommend really understanding if you're a beginner to this topic? So what are your favorite beginner insects?
Oh gosh. One are ladybugs. Like the first year we planted buckwheat, we had ladybugs almost instantaneously. And so I see them on buckwheat, I see them on cilantro, and they're cute to look at. They're voracious feeders of aphids, but they aren't something that we're necessarily intimidated by. Some insects I think that are good to have a better understanding of are flies and wasps. I think they kind of get a bad rap, but they are important pollinators and they are really great predators. So the more that we can understand about their life cycles and about what their intentions are for feeding, I think the less maybe afraid we'll be of them. I get a lot of wasps in my gardens, and I've yet to be stung. And I'm around them quite a bit. I get up in their personal space when I'm out there taking pictures and things, and they don't seem to mind me too much. Now, if I were around a nest, that would be a different story. But I just try to be mindful and, give them a little bit of personal space while also being a little bit intrusive, I suppose.
So what are some of the questions you guys have? We have a pretty good assortment of people here today. One question that come up in the first time was rotations or comments. You want to add anything to rotations? Does it help or harm? What are the goods and bads?
Crop rotation?
Yeah, crop rotation. How are you?
Yeah, I think it helps. One of the things I struggle with is because I'm in such a small space. I feel like the pests don't travel very far away from my garden. So even though I'm rotating a row, if I have tomatoes growing in a row one year and I move it 10 feet away the next year, the pests are still in and around my garden. So I think it definitely helps with, nutrient absorption and just having different root systems growing in the different spaces. In terms of pests, I'm not sure. I feel like the jury is still out on that for my space, just because it's so small that the pests, again, they just don't travel far enough away for me to really, I guess, know if the crop rotation helps in terms of that. And there may be some pests that don't travel very far that just stay right around those plants. But I don't know off the top of my head right now what those would be.
It's a lot easier for me in agriculture to rotate 20 or 30 acres
Right. Yeah.
away than your 10 square feet or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. 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 And I'm finding new pests too. Like this is the second year that we've had potato beetles, and we had much more activity from potato beetles this year. And it's amazing how fast they find the garden. Even, squash borer, I had not grown here ever until last year. First year I grow it, I get squash borer and all my plants die. So where those came from, I don't know if they came from a neighbor's house or if they had been dormant, but I didn't get any squash last year.
Yeah, environmental conditions, we've had a very wet, moist, cloudy year. And I know on agriculture, it's made a big difference. We see things that we don't normally see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it keeps things interesting for sure.
So one of the gems of our area is Huntington University. Mr. Porter, would you like to share? Or I see you have some students with us. Any comments, any additions? Because I know I love the place in Huntington.
One of the questions I had was put in the chat, but it's has to do with walnut leaves. You talked about putting leaves on your garden, but assuming you don't have walnuts right next to your garden, which have allelopathic properties, what would you do? Would you just kind of try to avoid putting them on altogether or mix them in, or what would you do in a case like that?
We actually have 2 walnut trees in our backyard, back in the back where the dog roams freely. And I don't worry about removing them from those garden spaces because everything that's growing back there is tolerant of the walnuts. So I leave the leaves in the backyard. I don't move them to the front yard. So I do try to make sure that I'm not, pulling those into my garden spaces. So that would definitely be something that you would need to make sure that you're not incorporating into food growing areas, especially unless there are some plants, some food crops that grow that are able to tolerate that. And I'm not sure of any that are right now. But in my ornamental beds, if I do any raking back there, I just rake the black walnut leaves into the beds that are back there because everything tolerates the black walnuts that's growing back there.
Also, just to introduce, we have with us a couple of students, but also our greenhouse manager here, Natalie Porter, who is also a master gardener, and so she had a question.
Yeah, my question is, on average, how much time do you spend gardening each day? Because I would say that, like me, if you could live out there, you would. But the average homeowner may have a job that's rather all-consuming, that has absolutely nothing to do with gardening. And so incorporating this into their particular lifestyle may be difficult. So that's why I'm wondering how much time you spend, and also for someone who really does want to begin gardening, how would you suggest they get started that in a way that will be sustainable for them?
For your first question, this has been a really different year for my garden. My husband and I took on a big project this year, which took me away from the gardens quite a bit. So not as much as I would like to have spent. I would say probably at minimum, probably a couple hours a day that I'm spending out there. On the weekends, on great days where I can take advantage of the weather, I may be outside for 6-7 hours a day, depending on what needs to happen. And it depends on what I'm growing too. If I'm direct seeding, if I've got plants to put in the ground, it definitely is all over the place. And it does take some time to find a good balance, to get a good rhythm and good systems in place, so that time is being used efficiently. And that all just comes with practice and experience. And I can't say that I've reached that point yet, unfortunately. Every year is a little bit different. In terms of somebody who's just getting started, I would probably recommend Curtis Stone, if you're familiar with Curtis Stone. He's an urban farmer out of Canada, who has a great book called The Urban Farmer. And that book, he focuses on selling food, and he's growing in small spaces, less than an acre, maybe even less than a half acre. And he's focused on selling. He's intensively growing. He's rotating crops pretty frequently. And he's focused on selling to especially restaurants, but also at farmers markets. But in it, he really lays out spacing on plants. One of the things I try to do, and I use a lot of his information, is when I'm planting things like root crops, even tomatoes, peppers. I used to plant tomatoes like every 4 feet. This year I planted them like every 18 inches. I plant carrots every couple inches, beets every like 3 inches, spinach every 6. And so his book is really helpful in kind of helping to guide a plan, an overall plan, so that you're not grasping at straws trying to figure out how to plant things space-wise, and how to rotate things. Utilizing other people, especially the mistakes that they've made, can be really beneficial, so that hopefully you don't make those same mistakes yourself. There are lots of different, it depends, I guess, on what the goal is for the person doing the gardening. There's a woman, her first name is Ruth. She was gardening into her 80s, and she started like this straw bale gardening. She stopped tilling, and she was just adding straw to her gardens to help suppress the weeds. And then she was putting, she was seeding in that. And that was, was a little bit more sustainable for her as well. It helped keep the weeds suppressed, added organic matter to the gardens. And long term for the growth of her garden, it was really great. So I would really recommend, YouTube is a great resource. Researching as many people who have established gardens, who have done some time in the gardens, who can share their knowledge. And I have, over the years, tried to research from, Curtis Stone doing small plots to looking at what some of the bigger farmers are doing. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to listen to Mike talk about cover crops. So I try to kind of take all of all this information that I'm finding and just scale it down to what I can actually use in my garden. And that's going to be different in anybody's garden, depending on what they're growing, what the location is. So I think that would probably be my, I guess, advice in terms of that, I suppose.
So
Thank
I think
you.
it was Natalie, right? I think you phrased your question wrong. It's why do we have to spend so much time away from our farm or garden?
Oh,
When
that's
you-
what I meant to say. Outside in my garden, I would, but I have
Yes.
other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not work when you love it, and
Yeah.
why can't we do more? Why do we have to go away? Is there any other comments, questions from anyone? Well, Marissa, I certainly appreciate your presentation. It was very, very good, very nice. So,
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thanks for inviting me, Joelle.
So Joelle, I'd kind of like her to say something on this urban small farms program she has here. Can you add?
You probably won't be able to see me because Mike and I are sharing audio, but not video. But we have a urban and small farms program here at the Allen County Soil and Water District. So we are offering free soil testing. If you are in the Western Lake Erie Basin watershed.
Are you muted?
No, they can hear through your computer.
Okay, good.
No, you're fine. So free soil testing for a certain watershed. We're also offering technical assistance. So if you have any questions, maybe we don't know the answers, but we can find people who do know the answers. We are also providing education like this webinar series that we've had all year, the Copy and series. That's going to continue for next year. If you have any questions, just call us. We are also providing scholarships for different education events. So if you have an education event you're interested in going to, but you can't afford it, reach out to us and you may be eligible for scholarships. So yeah, reach out to us. I also shared a link in the chat, and that was with the interview that I did with Marissa. So if you want to learn more about her garden operation and some more about her, you can watch that interview. It was really fun working with her. So.
All right, well, as Joelle said, thank you for joining us. This is our last one this year in 2021 because of the holiday season. December's not a good time. So we'll be back next year with our coffee and series. If you have any suggestions or what you want to talk, or somebody you really have heard that you want us to contact, let us know. We're always available at the SWCD here. And like Joelle said, we love talking and discussing and hearing problems, hearing solutions. So let us know.
Yes, if you have
Mike?
suggestions, please share to my email. I think I accidentally put a comma in that, but that's my email if you have any suggestions.
Yeah. So did we have another comment?
Mike, I have a suggestion. I'm not sure what you've done historically in these programs, but I do know that one of the questions that I get most frequently as a master gardener and even the greenhouse manager here is how does one prune and maintain fruit trees and grow small fruits? That's a big one. People often have that question.
Yeah, very good. Excellent suggestion. All right. As again, thanks everyone. This is a great time. It'll be available as soon as she gets it loaded on the link will be on our website so we can review it again. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.